Hey, what is happening, guys? Welcome back and Happy New Year. It is January 1st, 2016. Holy freaking crap, how did this even happen? I swear sometimes I feel like it's still 1999, let alone 2000, 2010, or 2016. We seriously just got off of the year that we had a new Star Wars movie, the first time in 10 years. I've been talking about that a lot on my last videos because it's Star Wars, and I just love that it's back, and I'm the biggest Star Wars geek, so it's just the only thing I can think of. Last night, to celebrate our first New Year's Eve in a new city, we actually didn't experience the city, my girlfriend and I, even though we've been to downtown Portland a couple times. We instead went to see Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens again, her second time, my third time, and then we went out for some drinks and stuff afterwards, so we still kind of celebrated a little bit, but that's what we did for New Year's. Hopefully you had a fantastic New Year's Eve. You did something, you were very safe, you were with people that you care about or someone that you love, all that mushy stuff. You know, it's a pretty big deal for New Year's to do those kinds of things. So hopefully you guys had a great one and a safe one. So now here we are at my first video for 2016, which is pretty exciting. I did say that I have upcoming soon my top 10 movies of the year for 2015, and that is still happening. But I'm still, taking another week or so to put that together because it's actually really hard to put that together. That's proving more difficult than my top 10 favorite games for 2015. So, again, like I said before, it's a good problem to have, but it makes it really difficult. But have no fear, I am going to be doing that. What I'm doing today is the first Users Question Corner I've done in quite a while, probably like 6 or 7 months. And I love doing these videos. I love asking for questions from you guys and answering something that you specifically want me to talk about. That's a whole heck of a lot of fun. Of course, I will remind you, I will put another call out for a question as well on Twitter and also on Facebook. But of course, if you have a question that you want to ask me, primarily gaming related, although you could technically ask me anything, leave it in the comments below and I might feature it. Give yourself a YouTube a shout out and feature your question on the next Question Corner video. But that out of the way, I'm going to answer today's question pretty quick. I don't think this should take too long, but with me, you never know. So I'm answering, again, this was only on Twitter that I asked for this, and I got a couple of responses. Not a whole lot, but I got a few, so thank you guys for asking. This question comes from Lil K Ray to the Bone. I think I spelled that right, or said that right, sorry. Lil K Ray to the Bone, also known as @LilKRay99. And so what's up? Thank you so much for your question, man. He's been a follower on Twitter for a while, so I super appreciate it. Really good question he asks. What are some retro game franchises, if I can even freaking speak? I didn't drink that much last night, Jesus. So what are some retro game... I did it again. What are some retro game franchises from the NES and N64 PlayStation era that you would want a sequel from? He lists examples such as Army Men, Lemmings, or Lost Vikings. I have to admit, I didn't even notice that NES was part of that question until just now, so I didn't prepare any of those, so sorry. What I actually did was I went through Nintendo 64 and PlayStation games, and it's interesting. I kind of, there was a couple that jumped to my mind immediately, and then I had to do some research to make sure I wasn't missing any other really big games from that time and on those systems. Really exciting question to answer. I super appreciate that. You ask me a retro game question because I'm old enough to have been gaming on the Atari, the NES, Master System, N64, all the way up through today. And the Nintendo 64, I've said a couple times, I think, on the videos, is my all-time favorite video game system. My favorite Nintendo system, my favorite video game system. N64, super badass. I was 16 years old when it came out, so it was like I was the perfect age to really get into gaming as it was evolving into 3D. It was very, very perfect. So I love the 64, and it's interesting as I was going through, a quick list of some of the bigger well-known games for the 64 and PlayStation to make sure I didn't forget anything. It was actually tough because a lot of the games and the series that were happening then are still happening today. It was actually harder than you might think to find games that aren't still happening, because I kept finding them. I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. Oh, but they're still making sequels. Oh, this one, I love that game. Oh, but there's been 6 more since then. So it was really hard to find, basically franchises that had stopped. But I found a couple. So one that jumped right to mind, didn't even have to look this one up, was Jet Force Gemini for the Nintendo 64. A lot of us might remember right near the end of the N64's life, one of, if not the last game Rare made for the Nintendo 64, back in the, the glory days of that partnership between Rare and Nintendo. It wasn't a game that, was a huge hit, but most people who were gaming at that time remember that Jet Force Gemini was this little just piece of gold. What a great action game with a unique world, It's like a third-person shooter on like an alien planet, and these crazy cool graphics, and I think it used the expansion pack. I might be wrong, but it was just a great game, and I would love to see a new game. I mean, there's been games kind of like that, but an actual Jet Force Gemini game. I don't know if that would have to be Rare making it for the Xbox, or if Nintendo could make it themselves, or have someone like Monolith or Retro make that for the Wii U or the NX. I would think probably Microsoft getting that game, which is too bad, but that's okay. As long as we got a new Jet Force Gemini game, that would be really fantastic. Wave Race was an amazing Nintendo 64 game, almost a launch title. I think that came out in the first 3 or 4 months of the system, and I'm sure most of us gaming back then remember how great Wave Race was. That game, we spent so much stupid time on that game. We made up rules and created our own gameplay modes and stuff for that. It was a lot of fun. They did have Wave Race Blue Storm on the GameCube as a launch title, which was great. It was a very, very, very good game. And, it's been dormant since. And that's obviously a Nintendo little internal franchise. I think we're primed to have the return of Wave Race. And I would worry that it might release as something like how Fast Racing Neo did, where it would just be like a downloadable indie kind of thing. And I would gladly take that over nothing, but I would love a full-fledged AAA retail packaged release for Wave Race. But God, Wave Race, that was the coolest water effects, man. If you go back and look at it now, it's almost like tinfoil, just like waving on the floor where your speeders things are. What are my jet skis are? But it looks kind of cheesy now. But at the time, it was like the most insane thing ever. Like blew our minds. A couple of PlayStation games too that I wanna bring up. Crash Bandicoot. Now, a little bit controversial because we know that was Naughty Dog, and didn't that get sold to Activision or Acclaim? You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. It was a Naughty Dog thing, and then I think Activision made some games, and I don't know if it left Naughty Dog completely or if they were just sharing the rights or what the status of Crash Bandicoot is now. So it might be impossible for that game to come out ever again, or it might just be a matter of one or both of these companies just pulling their heads out of their asses and saying, hey, we can make games that aren't just blood and shooting and swearing too. Maybe we can make a kick-ass platformer Crash Bandicoot game and bring that guy back from his glory days in the 90s. Crash Bandicoot, those were awesome games on the PlayStation, man. That was just so cool. The Battle Arena Toshinden, by the way, that's a series that not a lot of people ever talked about or really remember. That was just back in the genesis of like the 3D fighting games, like Virtua Fighter, when Mortal Kombat tried to go 3D with Virtua Fighter 4, Tekken was becoming a big new thing, and Battle Arena Toshinden was one of them. Great PlayStation series. I think they only made 2, Battle Arena Toshinden 1 and 2. And I remember having a crush on one of the big-boobed girls that was like the main girl for the thing, and I was a teenager, so, I was a sucker for that stuff. But just, regardless of that, as far as a fighting game, it was a really good series. It wasn't like the best, it wasn't revolutionary, but it was a really fun 3D fighting series back when 3D fighting was like the hot new shit. And not quite as good as Virtua Fighter at the time, but still really cool. So I'd love a new Battle Arena Toshinden. This one's a little bit weird for me to bring up. Parasite Eve. Now, the Parasite Eve games, from what I understand and what I've seen of those games, is they were very much like the original Resident Evil games. They were coming out in that same kind of time. Again, playing with new 3D graphics, with cinematic storytelling, like how other games on the PlayStation like Metal Gear Solid and Siphon Filter were happening. And Parasite Eve was this like sci-fi horror kind of thing, kind of mixing what it seems. I never played them. That's the weird thing here. Mixing like what Metal Gear did with what Resident Evil did. And where it was like this like spy espionage thing, but also with like a horror sci-fi kind of thing going on. And Parasite Eve's 1 and 2 looked really cool. I always wanted to play them, but I didn't have a PlayStation when they were relevant, unfortunately. And a lot of people who played those games thought they were great. I think a long time ago there was supposed to be a Parasite Eve 3, and they might have even had like a pseudo-sequel on the PSP, I think, like 5 or 6 years ago. But then I don't think we ever officially got Parasite Eve 3. And I could be wrong. Maybe the PSP game was Parasite Eve 3. But I would love just to have that series come out today with like a current relevant Parasite Eve experience, some sort of sequel, whether it would be 3 or 4 or just an offshoot, but treated like a big deal, because I really want to get into that world, and I've seen a couple Let's Plays and some reviews and stuff of those games in the past, and I was like, damn it, I wish I had a chance to play those. So it's a series I've never played, but a series I would love to see come back and have a release today so I could try to get into a newer version of that game. Going back to the 64 games, I should say, that I want to continue today. This is like a dumb one to bring up, but I can't help but bring it up. Banjo-Kazooie, hell the fuck oh. Are we ever going to get a true Banjo-Kazooie? It's great that Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie got a release on the Rare Replay, but that's the same games from 20 years ago. Like, we want the true new game. We all want that. JonTron is quaking in his boots to have a Banjo-Kazooie game again, and we all know nuts and bolts wasn't what we were looking for, so maybe we can still dream that an actual traditional Part 3 game might come out one day. Probably not, but it's, as far as games I would like to see come back, Banjo-Kazooie is certainly one of them. Diddy Kong Racing, great game. What a weird, quirky thing that was to release at the time that Mario Kart was becoming its own little empire. And, using Donkey Kong and Nintendo characters with kind of like a hub open world sort of setting, and you can, play as, a go-kart or, a hovercraft over water, or an airplane. And it was such a great idea, and it was the visuals were awesome, and they had boss battles and stuff in them. Not as good as Mario Kart, but we certainly played a lot of it because we were like, hey, this is great. This is a great aside to Mario Kart. And at least there was a story kind of to go through with Diddy Kong Racing. I think that was pretty cool. 1080 snowboarding. I'm from Colorado, so I am a snowboarder, which means I love snowboarding games. And 1080 snowboarding was one of the first snowboarding games I played that was kind of like a simulator a little bit, still with some personality. Cool Borders was also happening around that time for the PlayStation, and those were good games, but I didn't want to include those because I think 1080 was actually the better game. And we did get 1080 Avalanche, I want to say, in the GameCube. Good game. That was a good game for sure, but not quite as good. It had a good soundtrack. It had a good early 2000s rock soundtrack, like Seether and Three Doors Down and stuff was on there, which was pretty interesting, But 1080 was just great, and I just want a snowboarding series, period, to come back. SSX is the king, so I'm sure one day we'll get that, but 1080 was a great N64, a great Nintendo 64 and GameCube snowboarding series, and I'd love to see that come back in a modern setting today as well. And I have two really big final ones that I want to discuss. So one is Turok Dinosaur Hunter, because that game was so mind-blowing. That was one of the most immersive games I've almost ever played. As far as at the time it was released, excuse me, it wasn't really open world. I think it was a 1997 release for the first game. Second game came out a couple years later, also badass. But there was something about Turok with the music and the setting and kind of the eerie creepiness of the worlds and the amazing weapons and amazing visuals. That was one of the best looking games I'd ever seen at the time it came out. And I don't know, it was just awesome. It was such a crazy idea, and you're hunting these dinosaurs and then also these humans, and you get all these crazy weapons. And it was also really bloody, which was just so cool at the time, I remember you could shoot a guy in the neck and they would hold their neck and his blood would squirt out, cheesy graphics, but just pew, pew. And we were just oh, that's amazing, because blood in video games was still semi-new, and so seeing games get bloodier and bloodier was a really exciting thing in the mid-90s. And, Turok just did that perfectly. And it was, again, at the genesis of console first-person games as they were figuring them out. Very revolutionary in the first-person genre. And people don't give it enough credit. People always refer to GoldenEye, which was, granted, the king at that time, absolutely. But Turok was also kind of, to me, in that same conversation, or at least it belongs in that conversation for what it was doing for first-person games on the Nintendo 64 in the mid-90s, mid to late 90s. Those first two games were just so stinking good. And I have a deep-seated love for Turok Dinosaur Hunter. And also, I know very recently on the PC, they released an HD kind of remaster of it, which is great. I hope they release that on consoles. I don't really want to download it on my PC. I want to play that game on my big TV. But I also would love just a brand new one. And yes, Turok, they did Turok Evolution or whatever for the 6th gen, which was really not that great. And then they did the other Turok for the PS3 and 360 in 2008 or something. And it was a valiant attempt, but they just tried to go too serious. Fucking game makers today, they want to make everything so serious and dark and mature. And it's you don't have to do that. We don't need every game to get darker and darker and more serious. It's just, you don't have to do that, We like our Crash Bandicoots and our Marios, and our Banjo-Kazooies, and we like our Turoks to be a little bit goofy. Granted, those were mature games and they were bloody, but they had this, kind of cartoonish personality to them. And, you gotta keep that. That's the spirit of those games. And, you know, I know why they tried to make them gritty, because everyone just wants fucking blood and swearing in every game. And it's like, you know what? Don't do that, you know? So bring Turok back the way it needs to be. That would be very exciting to me. And my final one is very relevant to today, and that is Star Wars Rogue Squadron. Because what the hell? Why haven't these games been being made for way longer than they have been? Now, there's been 3 official Rogue Squadron games, and the first one was on the Nintendo 64, so that's why it qualified to answer the question here. And great space and flight combat Star Wars games with where you're going levels and missions, and you have objectives to accomplish, and they just felt so Star Wars, you know. First one came out, it would have been right before, I think, George Lucas started to work on The Phantom Menace, so right before the prequels even came out, so it was really, you know, building on that early hype of like, maybe we'll get new Star Wars movies, and eventually we did, which was awesome. And the Rogue Squadron games were great. Rogue Squadron 2 for the GameCube is the best of the 3 without question. But they were all good in their own way, and that's a series that should be continuing, and especially now more than ever with the new Star Wars trilogy. And, you know, EA, for better or worse, has Star Wars licensing rights right now. They just released Star Wars Battlefront, which I do love, even though there's some issues, and I worry about the future. As a game, I do like Battlefront. But what about just an actual kick-ass Rogue Squadron game? You know, that would be fantastic. Now, there was, a couple of years ago, actually a little before that, right leading up to the release of like the PS3 and the Wii and stuff, there was apparently a new Rogue Squadron being made at the time and being worked on. It was going to be like a GameCube game, then it was going to be a Wii game, then it was going to be a PlayStation 3 game, and then it turned into the PS3 launch game later. And I actually made a video about that when that information came out around a year ago. If I can find it, I might try to remember to link it below. There was a lot happening there where they were like trying to do it, but they couldn't get everything to work out the way they wanted. There was different issues with developing and finishing and finding the platform and this and that and the other. And eventually Shuhei Yoshida said, hey, we need a new game to launch our PlayStation 3, so why don't you just make it for that? And then during the development, once they signed on to make it PS3, it turned into Lair, the Dragon game, which apparently was terrible. So that whole Star Wars Rogue Squadron 4 got totally shot in the ass and never came out. And that really sucks, man, because I think that that's a game and a series that should come back. You know, again, as I said, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I think that that's a fantastic way to celebrate Star Wars, is to bring that series back. So, you know, that's probably the number one on this list because I'm a sucker for everything Star Wars. But, you know, really, Star Wars Rogue Squadron and Turok Dinosaur Hunter, of all of these great games I've mentioned, those are the ones that jump out to me the most from the N64, PlayStation 1, mid-90s era of gaming, series that kind of started at that time. Some of, you know, those games had a couple of releases since, but they're definitely dead now. And I would love to see them come back with a great brand new game that works for today's generation hardware and consoles and PC and make it really kick-ass. So, yeah, I think that pretty much answers the question. You know, those are a bunch of games that I would love to see come back today with sequels, you know, in the 2000s and the 2015s and all that. So, you know, what would you guys like to see come back? Tell me what you think about my answers. You know, you can answer the Twitter question that I answered today as well below with other series from that time that you'd like to see come back. Sorry I didn't do any NES games. I didn't notice that in time. And I don't know. So many NES games are actually also still continuing today. It's hard to say. I would say things like Metroid and Zelda, but they're still going. So, yeah, those are my answers. So thank you so much for the question again. Lil K Ray to the bone. Thank you again for being a pretty avid Twitter follower and a fan of the channel and asking a really kick-ass retro game question. Love doing that stuff. You guys should share your thoughts on my games as well as the games that you'd like below. Again, also remember, if you want your question answered on a question corner, I want to try to do these more often. So please ask me anything below that you'd like me to discuss in the future. And if I pick your question, I'll, you know, feature a whole video around it and I'll give you a shout out. So that's what's going on. One more time, Happy New Year. Don't forget to go see Star Wars. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. This is Rob with Review, and I'll catch you guys next time on another video.